Hello, Pastor Russell here. It's good to see you all here again, and we're wanting to have a look at Acts chapter 25 and 26 this morning, and trust that you're all comfortably seated. Welcome if this is new for you. It's certainly new for me being here and speaking to you from my lawn, my backyard, but it is rather pleasant, and I trust that God's going to speak to us. I'm wanting to look at these passages. If you haven't read Acts 25 and 26, please maybe just pause me right here and have a bit of a read. We're wanting to particularly look at Acts chapter 26 verse 19, where Paul sums up what he's saying, and he says, "So then, King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the vision from heaven." So let's pray and ask God to speak to us through this passage. Let's bow in prayer. Heavenly Father, we ask that your Spirit would come, guide us and lead us. We ask that you would open our hearts for your message. Lord, I pray that you would speak through me. I pray for each person here. Lord, that in the differences in their circumstances, in the differences in their needs, Lord, we thank you that the answer is the same. Jesus is the supply of all our needs. He is the one who is our first and foremost rock upon which we can trust. And so we pray that your Spirit would lead us and draw us to him in this time, for we ask in his precious name. Amen. I want us to look at 3 points in this passage. I want to particularly look first at the unusual circumstances that Paul found himself in, and obviously relate that to the quite unusual circumstances we find ourselves in. Then I'm going to look at this question of the unprecedented nature of these things. We've heard a lot about that, and then I'm going to have a look at how Paul was unstoppable, and hopefully that we can have stickability, we can continue to do the things which God wants us to do in these unusual, possibly unprecedented circumstances in which we find ourselves in. Not sure about you. I think for many of us the circumstances of our present time is very unusual for us. I know in the last couple of weeks it's like every part of my life has transformed. I usually play football on a Thursday. That's one of my main exercises. They've shut that down. I don't have church on Sunday. Last Sunday, instead of the normal 150, 200, 220 people, I had a little group of 5 and I sat down and watched myself speak on the TV. Hopefully there was a few of you as well. All of the things I normally do on a week have all been turned radically upside down. Kids Club, which I usually spend a whole Friday on, has been stopped, and it's like my whole life has changed. And preaching like this and ministering to you like this is a whole new thing. So if your life has changed, if your life's in difficulty, I'm certainly feeling the same way. And I know already that there's some people among you who have lost jobs. We've heard of a few names mentioned of people who have been laid off. We've spoken to quite a few of you who are worried about their jobs, particularly those in casual employment and in hospitality. And we know as a nation, even many in the world are really facing uncertain and unusual challenges in this time. And we know that this is a challenge to us. It's a challenge to our faith. It's a challenge to our relationships, both very close relationships in our families, in our churches, and also in our nations. And so I want us to think and maybe just see if we can learn some things from the Apostle Paul. In this passage, as we've read it, we've seen the Apostle Paul is sort of just come to the end of a 2-year period. He's had a Jewish council, the leading rulers of the Jewish nation. They've been pursuing him. 20 odd years before this time, he had been working with them to try and wipe Christianity off the map and to kill this new good news of the gospel in its infant stages. He had persecuted Jesus, and now Jesus had appeared to him, and now here he was being persecuted by the Jewish council. And we've seen how they've taken him to first Felix, then Festus, and now in this passage here we see the Festus and Agrippa sitting down and trying to discuss what to do with this man Saul of Tarsus, who's now called Paul. And part of the unusual circumstances is that the rulers realise that there's actually no evidence for any criminal activity. They can't find a criminal case, a law that is broken. All they can see is that this man Paul is testifying that Jesus was the Messiah, that he was crucified, that he died on the cross for people's sins, and he's risen again, and he is now the Lord of all. He has been given all authority, and he is the first fruits of the resurrection, and so he becomes the major centre and focus of humanity's hope. And so they realise that as they're talking and wondering and discussing about this man Saul, they're wondering what on earth to do with him. They've already decided that they're going to send him to Caesar, but they actually don't know what charge that they're going to give on the documents that they send to Caesar. And so that's what this chapter is about. And we see that these amazing circumstances for Paul, just as for us, were exceedingly unusual. Now, the second point I want us to look at is the word unprecedented. We know that in Australia we've seen over the past few months, if you've been watching the media at all, the word unprecedented has been bandied around a lot. I've heard it hundreds and hundreds of times as I was trying to keep abreast with the horrific fires we had, especially in the eastern states. Western Australia was quite spared this year, but the eastern states saw amazing bushfires. They certainly were horrific, and there was a lot of question as to whether they were the worst ever. I'm not sure about that. I know that Australia has a history of amazing fires, of drought and flooding rains, and it's been quite amazing. But an untold story is that we've actually had possibly unprecedented in some sense rains since those times, both to extinguish the fires and to start the cycle of God's blessing on the eastern states again. And so we've seen that happening, and this new crisis which we find ourselves in, COVID-19, a new virus which has suddenly jumped from its proper place of being a blessing in creation, has suddenly jumped into humanity and is now wreaking havoc over the world. And Australia is certainly responding in an unprecedented way. It appears so far that COVID-19 in the world has already infected a confirmed 500,000 people, and 25,000 people have died, it seems, from this. And this is really bad, and it's a shock. And what our nation and our politicians and leaders are trying to do is to really try and stop this disease, which could leave many, many people dead, and really affect the health of quite a number of people, maybe tens, hundreds of thousands of people, and they're concerned about it. Already in Australia we've had 3,400 cases, 200,000 tests, but only 13 deaths. Every death's a tragedy, but so far we've been spared some of the trauma that's already happened in other countries, and we're seeking to stave that off. But is it unprecedented? As I've been thinking about that, I've had a bit of a look through recent history, and I look back to 2017 when just through an epidemic of the flu, we had 745 people died in Australia. In America, that same flu caused the death of 79,000 people. And if we go back a few years before that to 2009, we had the swine flu came through, killed, they're not sure how many people, from 150,000 to maybe 500,000 dead. As we look a bit further on through the 20th century, smallpox killed 300 million people in the 20th century. A thing which really did touch Australia, the Spanish flu, just after the First World War, or toward a little bit of the end of the First World War, we saw 50 million dead worldwide. 20 million Australians, 2 million Australians caught it, and it's thought that about 15,000 people died, and a third of those were young men and women in between 25 and 34, and a lot of children as well. So, yes, we have very unusual circumstances. The extent of this crisis we find ourselves in is different from others, but it depends what we mean by unprecedented. But as I've thought about this and as I've looked at the scriptures and saying, well, what do the scriptures say? Well, I think the scriptures say the same things which we're all feeling, and that is we're feeling that we're vulnerable. We're feeling the thing which God said to Adam, as Adam and Eve fell into sin. He said, "Dust you are, until dust you shall return." I've read some of the Psalms. I've asked you to maybe read Psalm 103, where it talks about how our life is exceedingly fragile. We can be here one day and gone the next. We're also, I think, learning that despite all of the technology, all of the blessings of the increased knowledge we have of medical knowledge and a lot of the blessings of modern civilization, that we can't control everything. And I think Western society is feeling a renewed sense of our inability to control every aspect of our lives. And I think we're also starting to get a feel that we have been an ungrateful people, even fearful, in the midst of what has been a wonderful time in Western society, where I think Western society particularly has felt the wonderful blessings of having a Christian foundation to our society, the blessings of scientific knowledge, which had a lot of its roots in Christian thinking and the scriptures, that in a sense, although we've received these marvellous blessings, we very wrongly turned our backs on the Creator. Instead of being exceedingly grateful for Him, we've been ungrateful, and instead of responding to His incredible kindnesses to Him, that we have been spurning His law, turning our backs on the foundations, on His laws, and on the wonderful hope of the gospel. And I think also and I've gone through some of those previous pandemics we've had, is we realise that in history, it is as Jesus said, there's a constant refrain where we see wars, rumours of wars, forces which are seeking to lead us away from the knowledge of the gospel and from obedience to Christ. We're seeing warnings against sin. We're seeing earthquakes, famines, pestilences, and we see that, for instance, in Jesus, where He talks about the second coming. He said to us as Christians particularly, He said, "Watch out that you are not deceived, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am He. The time is near. Do not follow them.' When you hear of wars and revolutions, do not be frightened. These things must happen first, but the end will not come right away." Then He said to them, "Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes, famines, pestilences like COVID-19 in various places, and fearful events and great signs in heaven." And so I think we're being reminded again that in history, in amongst what is properly amazing grace and amazing goodness from God to a people who turn their backs and who are rebellious, he is sending these warnings to say, my patience does not last forever, a day of judgment is coming. And so I think despite people's rebellion, I think this sound is starting to ring in our ears. And I think maybe some of the people even watching today, you're starting to be scared. I know if you're driving along on the road and you suddenly see a speed camera there, you go, oh, am I speeding? And you start examining yourself. And these things which we see through history are God's constant warnings to say, are you submitting? Are you ready? Are you prepared for the day when we shall face God and stand before him? And so the third thing I'd like to mention is to see how Paul was unstoppable. For 2 years he was locked up in prison. And what did he do in that 2 years? As he said to Agrippa, as he was sharing his testimony of how he had come to see the crucified and risen Christ, whom he says to Agrippa, you know about them, you know about the prophets, you know that God has promised a Christ, you've heard about Jesus. These things were not done in a corner. The fact that the Christ had come and performed all these wonderful miracles that had been rejected, and then he had been crucified, and then he had risen from the dead. You're aware of those things, and so are the soldiers and the people who are in that courtroom. And he's saying to him that I was not disobedient. I've remained unstoppable despite what's happening to me now. People threatening me with death if I don't shut up and silence myself. And he said, but I've been faithful. I have refused to be silent, and I'm not silent to you. And in that conversation, Festus, as you're hearing, it says, Paul, your learning has driven you mad. Shut up. That's it. But Paul goes, I said, no, I've not lost my mind. What I'm saying is reasonable, logical, and proven. And I'm begging you guys to respond to the authority of Christ. And so we see that Paul continued to be unfaithful despite the threats. Not only that, he rejoiced in the Lord. It's amazing to see the things which he overcame, but he remained focused and obedient. One of the things he did, obviously, was he used his time wisely. If you read carefully his testimony and the fact that Luke writes it, you can see that him and Luke have actually used the time that they've got to prepare their defence, but not just a defence to show that Paul was innocent, but prepare a presentation of the gospel to these kings, because he knew if he can change a king's heart, he can change many others besides. And so Paul used his time wisely. He not only did that, he used that 2 years in prison to encourage the believers. He met with Luke, he met with people like Philip and maybe his 4 prophetess daughters and many other people, constantly working. Although he's chained to a Roman soldier, Paul is using the time wisely, even though he's cooped up, just as we are. And we have tremendous opportunities to be like Paul, to say, well, what can I do? Even though I've got certain things and certain restrictions, what can I do to remain faithful to Christ, to continue to love him and to love his people and to serve him? And so that's what he did. He was obedient to Christ, not disobedient. Now, just want to conclude with just some amazing passage. I'd encourage you to read Psalm 103, but also have a look at 2 Corinthians 2, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. I just want to read a few verses from that to encourage us. Paul wrote, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard pressed on every side, but we're not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair. We're persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our bodies the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may be revealed in our mortal body. So then, death is at work in us, but life is at work in you. Now, Paul's sufferings and problems, in a sense, unprecedented sufferings and opposition he faced, he was able to rise above them, and he challenges us: rise above your circumstances, be unstoppable for Christ, use the opportunities you have to show in a mortal body of clay, in amidst the difficulties of life, to show that Christ is alive in you and you know him. And so I'll conclude with those words in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 16 and 18. Therefore, he says, we do not lose heart. Though outwardly we are wasting away, inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For light and momentary troubles, probably more true for us than Paul, light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. I challenge you, church family. This is a chance to shine in the midst of a world who's suddenly being waken up to the truths of the gospel, and suddenly being waken up to an awareness of their sin. Suddenly the light is shining, fears are arising, and suddenly the feeling, oh, I'm undone. I've been pushing against the Creator. I think as people rise in fears, we have the chance to enable them to rise in hope. So we trust that you will shine for Jesus, trust him, grow in your faith, in your love, and in your hope in this time, for Jesus' sake. God bless you all.